Exploring the Analects, Episode 3, Passage 10.12, Parking Reserved for Employee of the Year. Hey folks, this is Elliott Bernstein. Thanks for joining me on Episode 3 of Exploring the Analects. Today we'll be talking about Passage 10.12 of the Analects, a 5-character phrase about sitting. Since this is only the 3rd episode, I'll give a little introduction to the series before we hop into the quote. These podcasts focus on passages from the Analects, a collection of hundreds of quotes attributed to Confucius and passages regarding Confucius's life. These passages were written and compiled by followers of the Confucian Way in China between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. They touch on a whole range of topics that can still teach us how to live our lives today, and range in length from just a few syllables to several paragraphs long. Here's a bit about the format of the show in the series. We're covering the shortest passages first, so the phrases in these early episodes are just 4 or 5 characters long. In each episode, I start off with an introduction to the passage, give an informal translation, read the Chinese, then provide a more faithful translation. Next, we talk about the philosophy, history, and culture behind the quote. After that, I provide some pointers on the language. And finally, I comment on the passage's place in the Analects, as well as varying interpretations that might not have fit in elsewhere. Now that that's covered, let's jump in and take a look at the quote. As I just mentioned, I'll start off with an informal interpretation of 10.12. Don't expect it to stick too closely to the Chinese, but do expect it to capture something about its spirit. I want the modern phrasing and subject matter to give you something to hang your hat on as we dive deeper into the subject. And here it is. Parking reserved for Employee of the Year. The other day, I was walking through a parking lot. I saw a sign in front of one of the spots reading, Parking reserved for Employee of the Month, and another right next to it, Parking reserved for Employee of the Year. Never saw that second one before, so it stuck with me. Say you were driving through that parking lot looking for a spot, and it was pretty packed, but that Employee of the Year spot was open. You know, it's right next to the door. Would you take it? Would you feel a little guilty if you did? I probably wouldn't park there, but I have parked in those curbside delivery spots more than I'd like to admit. Anyway, that's just a little nugget for you to chew on, and it's kind of the question, both literally and metaphorically, that we'll be talking about in 10.12. Next, I'll read the quote in modern Mandarin, then follow up with a more faithful translation into English from Professor Pei Min-Yi's book, Understanding the Analects of Confucius. Xi bu zheng bu zuo. He would not sit unless his mat was correct. At its most basic level, 10.12 is about where Confucius felt it was appropriate for him to sit. In his lifetime, 6th and 5th century BCE China, chairs had not been invented yet, so people sat on sitting mats. And in this passage, Confucius's followers note that his habit and preference was to only sit on a sitting mat if it was correct. Now, believe it or not, there's a whole lot more to talk about here. But at this point, you've got the basic context you need to understand the literal meaning of the phrase, Xi bu zheng bu zuo, or he would not sit unless his mat was correct. Now let's dive in a bit deeper and discuss some of the interpretations and ideas behind the phrase. This section might appeal to you if you're interested in the philosophical, historical, and cultural context behind the passage. Following that, I'll talk a bit about the language. Today I'm going to mix things up a bit and talk about the passage's place in the Analects in this section, because Chapter 10 is very different from most of the Analects. Chapter 10 is known as Xiangdang, or Confucius in his hometown. As a side note, chapter titles in the Analects and many Chinese classics are taken from among the first words in the chapter, and chapters are also frequently referred to as books. So this is the same thing as Book 10 of the Analects. Chapter 10 is different because there are very few quotes of Confucius compiled within it. Very little of that Zhou stuff we talked about in previous episodes. Instead, it's a collection of descriptions of Confucius's habits, life, and preferences. Many of these focus on what you might consider minutiae, things like the way he walked when going to greet guests, the clothes he wore at different times of year, and the food he would and would not eat. So, a short description of where he felt it was appropriate for him to sit isn't at all out of place in this chapter, but it might seem like a real departure otherwise. So now you know why this passage feels a bit different, but you're probably still wondering what it means. Now, I could give you a straightforward answer and tell you Ames and Rosemont say it's about sitting in a position appropriate to your own rank relative to others in the room, or that Peimen Ni says it's about making sure the mat is properly positioned. But leaving it at that wouldn't be very much fun, not to mention what a crummy podcast that would make. So here's the refreshing truth, and something that's going to be true about most of these passages. I don't know what it means. And no matter what they say, nobody else alive today does either. We're working with 5 ideograms that literally mean mat not correct, don't sit. There's no punctuation, no intonation. There are possible scribal errors over the course of centuries. So I'll say it again and stress the point. Nobody knows what this means. But what we can do is consider some of the likeliest possibilities for what it's about and talk about why they make sense. I keep referencing Professor Peimen Ni's book called Understanding the Analects of Confucius for a reason. He's very good at doing this. When a passage's meaning isn't self-evident, which actually means most of the time, he references the most historically important interpretations by scholars like Mencius, Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming, and explains why they seem more or less likely. Now that I'm done with this digression, I'll do a bit of that too. Here's possibility number 1. Confucius thought it was important to keep his space orderly, and this was a pretty straightforward statement about how he wanted his sitting mat in the right place in his home, evened out, aligned with some walls, in a good position within the room, or something along those lines. If we take it this way, it's more or less telling the reader, make your bed, push in your chairs, throw your laundry in the hamper. Keep your home nice and orderly. The first few times I read this passage, it seemed straightforward enough, and this was really the only interpretation that occurred to me. I'm actually not the only one. I found casual references to this passage on the Chinese web that take it this way, and the widely available 19th century English translation of the Analects by James Legge, even though it's not the most scholarly, it does take this view. It also aligns with other passages in Chapter 10 that show Confucius was very picky about a lot of things. 10.6 tells us about the colors he would pair with different fabrics and furs. 10.8 tells us he didn't want to eat meat that wasn't cut properly. As a side note, some commentators actually believe 10.12 was originally part of 10.8. So, sure, he probably did care a whole lot about how things were placed in his home and how his home was used. And Confucius even famously called out his disciple, Zai Yu, saying, "You can't carve rotten wood." because the guy was sleeping at home during the day. Oh. Anyway, I find this interpretation just a little too simplistic. The Analects repeatedly makes the point that we shouldn't have rules just for the sake of having rules. Confucius taught that ritual and a sense of propriety were important because of the way that they create harmony between people. So let's put this aside and consider another possibility about social relationships and order. Here's possibility number 2. Confucius believed the position and style of the mat should reflect one's rank and status relative to others. Confucius had a lot of students. We've mentioned a couple of them by name already. We just talked about Zai Yu, and there's also Tan Tai Mieming. There was another of his students named Yan Hui. Of all of Confucius's disciples, Yan Hui was the one that he heaped the most praise on. This guy was a real teacher's pet. So I'm just imagining Yan Hui won the Student of the Year award more than once in his time, and maybe, you see where I'm going with this? Maybe the seat right next to Confucius had seating reserved for Student of the Year written on it. Not literally, but it had an extra pad, some special color, some fancy embroidery. The works. If Yan Hui was Student of the Year, would you sit in his seat? Well, probably not if anyone was looking. This is just like my fun interpretation at the beginning. Don't take it too seriously, because I have no idea if there was a Student of the Year seat. It's just an example to get you thinking. And anyway, this idea is alive and well today, not just with parking spots, but at birthdays, family dinners, company meetings, and other scenarios. Who sits next to whom? Who sits in the seat of honor at a celebration? Who sits in which seat of the car? People do have rules for these things. And even if you don't use words, you're saying something when you decide to respect or ignore these rules. If you're looking for strong evidence that this is what the Analects is talking about, it's actually not hard to find. 20th century commentator Chairman Mao points to the Book of Rights, or the Li Ji, which tells us that the number of layers on a sitting mat varied by rank. The Zhou king would have 5 mats. His feudal lords would have 3, and ministers and officials would have 2. Seating orientation followed strict directional rules. West is the honored position for north-south facing seats, and south is the honored position for east-west facing seats. In passage 6.1, Confucius is quoted as saying that one of his most human-hearted disciples, quote, could be put in the position of facing south, meaning that it wouldn't be inappropriate for his disciple to sit in the position reserved only for an authority. Well, now that you probably know more about what it was like to sit around in Zhou-dynasty China than all your friends, let's wrap up this section and look a bit more at the language. As a reminder, we're looking at the 5-character phrase, xi bu zheng, bu zuo. As I said above, these 5 characters literally mean, mat not correct, don't sit. But the real difficulty in translation in this phrase comes from the 3rd character, zheng. We've actually already seen this character in our first episode when I discussed zhengming, or rectification of names. Rectification means to straighten things out, so you can see where it would be tempting to translate this zheng as straight. We shouldn't forget that idea of straightness, but we should take correctness as the primary meaning, like zheng means in the modern Chinese word zheng cui, or accurate. But when I said that we shouldn't forget the idea of straightness, I meant we still need it to get to the full picture of what bu zheng means. Whether or not something is straight may depend on its alignment, and alignment is a relational concept. Consider words like 正常, normal, and 正面, front. These are both relative positions. Normal is on a spectrum of frequency, and front is in a position relative to sides and back. So when we say that sitting mats are 不正, there's little doubt that we should be concerned with their position relative to something. And because Confucius's teachings were so concerned with social relationships and repeatedly stressed focusing on the secular before the spiritual, we can put aside the idea that this 不正 refers to some abstract spatial yin-yang or feng shui type orientation. A couple of other quick notes on language. The character for sitting mat, xi, is still used today in the title 主席 or chairman. This title is used in companies and organizations, but where you're most likely to hear it is in reference to Chairman Mao, Mao Zhu-xi. This title frequently gets translated into English as president these days, and I think there's been a fair amount of discussion of that on podcasts like Sinica and Barbarians at the Gate. So I won't go into it right now, but I highly recommend that you give both of these podcasts a listen if you haven't. Finally, this is another topic comment type phrase. Remember, the topic is, the mat's not right. And the comment is, don't sit. There's no explicit if-then language in this phrase. Instead, it's implied by the grammar, and every English translation will end up using if, unless, or some similar word to avoid the awkward double negative. This is the beauty of classical Chinese, and the closest that we can get to this level of terseness in English is still something like, if the shoe fits, wear it. All right, since we've already done a serious deep dive into varied interpretations and the positioning of this passage in the Analects, we're going to wrap things up here. Again, this is your host, Elliott Bernstein. I hope you enjoyed this third episode of Exploring the Analects. Next, we're going to read 15.41, another 5-character passage and one of my personal favorites, in which Confucius comments on the purpose of language. See you there.